single tenant. So this is what an AIR form looks like. So you put in the name of the landlord as the lessor. So let's call it ABC Corporation. And then the name of the lessee, Russian School of Med. And the description for the property, you know, it could be a an address like a 123 Main Street, located within the county of Santa Clara, state of California. Okay, Sunnyvale, for instance. And then you need to have a description for the project, depending on, you know, sometimes the project has a name, whatever the name is. And the term, let's say, is 5-year term and 0 months. Those are the original term without the option. Commencing on, let's say today, 8/07, and ending on May 7th, if it's a 5-year lease. 2. Assuming we don't have early possession, sometimes the tenant may be allowed early possession. So if the tenant is allowed early possession, then you put down the early possession date. For example, April 1st to 27th. For example, this might be June 8th, June 7th. And this might be base rent, let's say, is $4,000 a month, payable on the first of the month, first day of each month, commencing June. Oh, sorry. How about July 1st, 2017? Okay. So there may be something in there that will require adjustment on the rent, so you check on the spot. Doesn't allow me to check, but that's okay. Base rent and monies paid upon execution. Instead of making this start on June the 8th, might be easier if I make it start on June 1st. So this one says so if I make it start on June 1st, but this tenant has got an early possession date. So he doesn't pay any rent from May the 8th to May the 31st. So the base rent is $4,000, and that would be for the period. This is to be paid upon execution, so it will be for the period of June 1st 2017 to 30. And let's say we ask for a 2 months deposit. So, okay. Association fees, this one, how about we make the tenant pay for the association fee? This is the net fees. Okay. So the association, let's say it is $1,200, and it's for let's say it's for July. See, this association might be charging the association dues on a quarterly basis. So it goes from January to end of March and April 1st to end of June. And if we make the association, let's say July 1st, 2017 to September 30,000. Association fees remain the tenant pay for that. Total due upon execution of the lease, it's 4,000 plus 8,000 is 12,000, so it's 13,000. The grid use, let's call it office use. And then you go in here, you put down the agent's name, the source agent. Check. Okay? We don't know, maybe the C doesn't have an agent, so it's just us. Just one word on dual agency. Normally, we don't do dual agency unless we get paid more money. So we don't have to represent the tenant. We're not obligated to represent the tenant. So it'll be just us representing the landlord. Tenant is unrepresented. Payments to broker, usually we do it on a separate agreement, so we don't have to specify it here. And the guarantor, usually, on commercial lease, we'll have a guarantor. I'll call it John Smith as the guarantor. Usually, we'll have a plot plan depicting the premises, and then if there are any rules and regulations. Work letter is just a document setting forth tenant's requirements for tenant improvements that the landlord agrees to pay for. It's called the work letter. So that's usually included in commercial lease. The rest are just the standard provisions. Okay. I won't really go into everything here, but I will only look for certain things that I think might be worth mentioning, so I'll mention them to you. This language here is actually pretty standard of AIR form. Basically, if you look at 2.1, basically the square footage that is mentioned in the AIR lease is intended to be for references only, and is not to be used in the calculation of the rent amount. So if you reported a certain square footage in your lease and subsequently the tenant discovered that the actual square footage is actually less than what's specified in the lease, the tenant cannot go back and ask for a reduction in rent. Because that's what 2.1 is about. Okay. 2.2 basically talks about the landlord warranting the condition of the property. It says that The lessor shall deliver the premises to the lessee broom clean and free of debris on the commencement date or the early possession date, whichever first occur, start date. And so long as the required service contracts described in paragraph 7.1b below are obtained by lessee and in effect within 30 days following the start date, the lessor warrants that the existing electrical, plumbing, fire, sprinkler, lighting, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, loading doors, sump pumps, if any, and all other such elements in the premises, other than those constructed by lessee, shall be in good operating condition on said date, that the structural elements of the roof, bearing walls, and foundation of any buildings on the premises, i.e. the building, shall be free of material defects, and that the premises do not contain hazardous levels of any mold or fungi defined as toxic under the applicable state or federal law. What this means is that the existing service contracts that the landlord had that is has or the lessee is going to procure the service contract to maintain the structure of the building. The landlord actually warrants the structures, including the plumbing, electrical, heating, ventilation, free of defects, including the structural elements, to be free of material defects. So if there is something wrong with the building after the tenant takes over, and if it's something that existed at the time the tenant got possession, tenant is required to bring to the attention of the landlord. And then the landlord has an obligation to fix those things. However, the warranty period it says here the warranty period shall be as follows: 6 months as to the HVAC systems and 30 days as to the remaining systems and other elements of the building. What this means is, even on a net lease, the landlord has an obligation to make sure that the HVAC is free of defects. If defect is found within the first 6 months, it is the responsibility of the landlord to fix the HVAC system. However, the warranty period actually expires after 6 months. That means that if the HVAC breaks down after 6 months, landlord is not responsible for fixing it. So basically, good for 6 months for the HVAC. And then the rest of it, it's only 30 days. Okay? So that's the nature of a net lease. So the tenant actually has a very small window of warranty concerning the what do you call that, the different elements of that building. Now it says here, if lessee does not give lessor the required notice within the appropriate warranty period, correction of any such non-compliance, malfunction, or failure shall be the obligation of lessee at lessee's sole cost and expense. So really, I mean, if the problem shows up after the warranty period has expired, is really becomes the lessee's responsibility to make the repairs, not the lessor. So even on a net lease, there is a certain period of time within which the landlord will have an obligation to make repairs to the existing HVAC as well as other elements of the premises. Okay, let's go down further. On a net lease, and this is very typical of a net lease under the AIR, talks about compliance. Basically, the landlord warrants that the improvement of the premises comply with building codes, applicable laws, covenants, or restrictions of record regulations and ordinances, otherwise known as applicable requirements, that were in effect at the time that each improvement or portion thereof was constructed. Said warranty does not apply to the use to which the lessee will put the premises. Modifications which may be required by the Americans with Disabilities Act or other similar laws as a result of lessee's use, or to any alterations or utility installations made or to be made by lessee. What this means is, if the lessee, which is the tenant, decides to make some changes to the property to meet the specific use requirements of the lessee, and such change actually results in certain additional work that needs to be done to comply with the code section, that would not be the landlord's responsibility. The landlord only basically warranty that whatever the landlord built previously, at the time they were built, they were in compliance with the code. Now, some of these things might have been built a long time ago that might not be in compliance with the current code. So if a tenant takes over the property, and then the tenant needs to make some improvements or to make some changes, and then submit the tenant's application to the city, and the city now applies the most recent code. Any application of the most recent code, which is different from the codes that the landlord rely on when they make the improvements previously, those new code requirements will not be the responsible of the landlord. It is the responsible of the tenant. As you can see in bold, it says lessee is responsible for determining whether or not the applicable requirements, especially the zoning, are appropriate for lessee's intended use, and acknowledges that past uses of the premises may no longer be allowed. What that means is, it is the lessee's risk on the city's requirements, on the conditions of the property. If the city actually requires more stringent, the city actually applies more stringent requirements, it is not the landlord's responsibility to meet these more stringent requirements. It is the tenant's responsibility. It says here, if lessee does not give lessor written notice of a non-compliance with this warranty within 60 days following the start date, correction of that non-compliance shall be the obligation of lessee and lessee's sole cost and expense. What this means is, if, for example, certain improvements that were made years ago were not made in accordance with the city codes or city ordinance, and then the tenant does not discover this non-compliance until after 6 months is over, then it is the tenant's responsibility to make the correction and not the landlord's obligation. Even though it was the landlord who made such improvements not in accordance with the code at the time the landlord made the improvements. Now let's talk a little bit about delayed possession. Says here, landlord agrees to use his best commercially reasonable efforts to deliver possession of the premises to lessee by the commencement date. If, despite said efforts, lessor is unable to deliver possession by such date, lessor shall not be subject to any liability therefore, nor shall such failure affect the validity of this lease or change the expiration date. Lessee shall not, however, be obligated to pay rent or perform its other obligations until lessor delivers possession of the premises, and any period of rent abatement that the lessee would otherwise have enjoyed shall run from the date of delivery of possession and continue for a period to what lessee would otherwise have enjoyed under the terms hereof, but minus any days of delay caused by the acts or omissions of lessee. If possession is not delivered within 60 days after commencement, as the same may be extended under the terms of any work letter, lessee may add his option by notice in writing within 10 days after the end of the 60 days to cancel this lease. So in other words, when you sign an AIR lease agreement, one of the unique provisions in the AIR standard lease is that they allow the landlord to deliver possession of the property late as long as the delay is no greater than 60 days. So if you are a tenant and you're supposed to get possession on June 1st, for example, and the possession has been delayed due to the landlord's problem, the landlord actually has until August 1st to deliver possession, and still tenant has obligation to continue with this lease. So basically just a 2 months window for the delay by the landlord. If the landlord go past beyond the 2 months, the tenant cannot sue the landlord for delay in possession. However, the tenant can cancel the lease. That's the only remedy to the tenant. Um, Use, okay, there's nothing to talk about use. Usually we specify the use on the front page. If you go back to the front page, you see that I specified the use to be office use. Okay, so that has to be specified on the first page. Hazardous substances, standard provision on a commercial lease. I usually do not pay a lot of attention to it until something happens. And of course, the tenant always has an obligation to inform the landlord concerning any environmental release that has happened. You know, you always have this indemnification clause that protects the landlord. Basically, if the tenant engage in any activities involving hazardous substances and has been sued by a third party, and the landlord has also been sued, and it is completely the tenant's fault, then the tenant has to indemnify the landlord. Indemnify in this case would mean that the tenant will have to hire lawyers to defend the landlord if the landlord is sued by a third party due to the tenant's mistake in the release of the hazardous substance. Okay. skip this. Now, on the net lease, let's discuss what would be the tenant's obligations when it comes to repairs. It says here, and this is a single tenant net lease. Typically on a net lease, the tenant will have to do all the maintenance. It says here on 7.1, tenants, lessee shall at lessee's sole expense keep the premises utility installations intended for lessee's exclusive use, no matter where located, and alterations in good order, condition, and repair, whether or not the portion of such repairs occurs as a result of lessee's use, any prior use, the elements of the age of such portion of the premises, including but not limited to all equipment or facilities, such as plumbing, HVAC equipment, electrical, lighting, facilities, boilers, pressure vessels, fire protection system, fixtures, walls, foundations, ceilings, roofs, roof drainage systems, floors, windows. It's a pretty long list. And of course, from the tenant's perspective, if you represent the tenant, the one that you are most concerned with is actually the foundation and the roof. A typical net lease requires the tenant to repair just about anything and everything involving the structure of the building. Now, here we see foundations, roof, right? And then parking lots, landscaping, retaining walls, sidewalks, and parkways located in, on, or adjacent to the premises. They are all tenants' responsibility to maintain. And it also says, lessee in keeping the premises in good order, condition, repair, shall exercise and perform good maintenance practices, especially including the procurement and maintenance of the service contracts required by paragraph 7.1b. So if you represent the tenant, and if the landlord wants to use a standard single tenant net lease, you should advise your tenant that according to the AIR agreement, the tenant is required to sign a service contract with a service provider to maintain the building. That's what 7.1b is about. And then it goes further and says, tenant's obligations shall include restorations, replacements, or renewals when necessary to keep the premises and all improvements thereon, or part thereof in good order, condition, and state of repair. Pretty much everything is the responsibility of the tenant when it comes to maintenance. And the lessee, who is the tenant, shall also keep the exterior appearance of the building in a first-class condition. So in other words, if somebody sprays graffiti on the wall, it is the tenant's responsibility to remove the graffiti. Okay, so supposed to maintain the appearance of that building, and that's the responsibility of the tenant. And then it talks about service contract. The lessee shall, at lessee's sole expense, procure and maintain contracts with copies to lessor in customary form and substance for, and with contractors specializing and experience in the maintenance of the following equipment and improvements. So just sign a service contract with a reliable provider. If the tenant fails to do that, the landlord can actually do it on behalf of the tenant, but then the landlord will have a 15% surcharge. If you, the tenant, let the landlord take over the responsibility, it's actually more costly to you, the tenant. So if you don't get a service contract, landlord can get it for you, but their charge to you is 115% of the actual cost, which is like a 15% surplus. that they can charge you. Now, what if something cannot be repaired? And this is quite typical of a commercial lease. Let's say, for example, in the case of, how about the roof? Let's say, the roof is so old that the tenant really can't repair it. What do you do in this situation? You're going to have to replace the roof. And on the replacement on the roof, how is the tenant and the landlord going to allocate the expense? According to the replacement, subject to lessee's identification of lessor, as set forth in paragraph 8.7 below, and without relieving lessee of liability resulting from lessee's failure to exercise and perform good maintenance practices. If an item described in paragraph 7.1b cannot be repaired other than at a cost which is in excess of 50% of the cost of replacing such item, then such item shall be replaced by lessor, and the cost thereof shall be prorated between the parties, and the lessee shall only be obligated to pay each month during the remainder of the term of this lease, on the date on which base rent is due, an amount equal to the product of multiplying the cost of such replacement by a fraction, the numerator of which is 1, and the denominator of which is 144, which is a ratio of 144th, 1 over 144 of the cost per month. So if you have a roof that somehow needs a complete replacement during the term of the commercial lease, it is still the landlord's responsibility if the cost to replace is actually the repair cost. If the repair cost will exceed 50% of the replacement cost. So usually when they have a roof like that, when it's so old, and if the cost of repairing the roof is actually 50% or greater of the cost of replacing the roof, in which case the lessor, which is the landlord, will then undertake the responsibility to pay for the cost of replacing the roof, and then the cost actually get passed along to the tenant. So the tenant basically will somehow pay for the roof, except that the tenant is paying by installment because the total cost is divided by 144. That gets added to the rent each month. And it says here, the lessee shall pay interest on the unamortized balance, but may prepay its obligations at any time. Okay, so ultimately it's still the tenant who's paying for the cost of replacing the roof. Okay, because instead of paying one lump sum, the tenant is paying by installments. Utility installation. How is utility installation defined? Defined as floor and window coverings, and then air and or vacuum lines, power panels, electrical distribution, security and fire protection systems, communication cabling, lighting fixtures, HVAC equipment, plumbing, and fencing in or around the premises. That's called utility installations. It says here, lessee shall not make any alterations or utility installations to the premises without lessor's prior written consent. So if you're the tenant, you want to make any changes to the utility installation, you're supposed to get the landlord's consent before you make such changes. And of course, the lessee can always make non-structural alteration to the interior of the premises, excluding the roof, of course, without such consent. Let's say if you want to add something to the interior that is non-structural, you can actually do it without the landlord's consent. When it comes to any additions that the tenant makes to the property, we need to talk about the ownership. Whatever additions, whatever fixtures that the tenant makes to the property, they could become the owner. The ownership could belong to the lessor upon the termination of the lease. For example, it says here removal by delivery to lessee of written notice from lessor not earlier than 90 days and not later than 30 days prior to the end of the term of this lease. Lessor may require that any and all lessee-owned alterations or utility installations be removed by the expiration or termination of this. What this means is that it gives the landlord an option to decide if they want to keep any of the additions that is installed by the tenant. But if the landlord does not give such notice, then everything stays with the building. There may be certain things that the tenant installed that the landlord does not desire, in which case the landlord wants to remember to give the proper notice to the lessee to require the tenant to remove any undesired or not desired installation to be removed prior to the lessee leaving the premises. And of course, the lessee must always restore the premises in good repairs and deliver the premises back to the landlord in broom clean and free of debris conditions. That is a typical provision. Whether it's a gross lease or net lease, it doesn't matter. These are pretty standard. So it's actually, this is a common provision among the AIR leases. Here you have insurance requirements for lessee. It's very typical that they have per occurrence of $1 million and an aggregate of $2 million. Okay, so these are the insurance requirements. And of course, lessor will have his own insurance. Okay, lessor will always carry their own insurance. It says carried by lessee is the commercial general liability, and then carried by lessor is lessor's own liability insurance. And of course, lessee need not be named as an additional insured on lessor's insurance. Property insurance. Lessee will get their own insurance for their own business interruption losses. That's lessee's own responsibility, including workers' compensation. We'll skip this. Payment of taxes. Of course, this is very important. It says here, in addition to base rent, lessee shall pay to lessor an amount equal to the real property tax installment due at least 20 days prior to the applicable delinquency date. So because it is a triple net lease, it does obligate the lessee, who is the tenant, to make payments on the real property tax installment. And there are 2 installments every year. And the due date for making such payment is 20 days prior to the applicable delinquency date. For example, if the due date is delinquency date is April 10, then the deadline for the tenant to deliver the property taxes to the insurance, the real property taxes of the property to the landlord at least by March 20th, because that will give the landlord 20 days to pay the property tax from the money that the landlord receives from the lessee before the delinquency date. So that this one ensures that it is the lessee, the tenant, that pays the real property tax, because it is a net lease. And of course, the lessee will pay their own personal property taxes. Utilities, and of course it says tenant will pay their own utilities, everything. Okay, so tenant pays for insurance, tenant pays for maintenance, and then the tenant pays for its utilities, and tenant pay for property taxes. So this is what we call a triple net lease. The rest are pretty standard. We'll cover these standard provisions next time. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to do that. Next time I'll cover it. Today is just a general introduction on triple net leases. But this one is a unique one. This is for single tenant, okay? Next time we might be talking about multiple tenant triple net lease, which is slightly different from this one. Late charge, that's typical. And this one, the standard actually calls for 10% late charge, or $100, whichever is greater. 10% is a lot. Brokerage fee standard, you don't go over that. Stopper certificate standard. Notice requirements. You might want to pay attention to notice requirements. It says all notices required or permitted by this lease or applicable law shall be in writing and may be delivered in person, by hand, or by a courier, or may be sent by regular certified or registered mail or U.S. Postal Service express mail with postage fee paid, or by facsimile transmission, and shall be deemed sufficiently given if served in the manner specified in this paragraph 23. So notices can be delivered many different ways, okay? And then the addresses noted adjacent to a party signature on this list shall be that party's address for delivery or mailing of notices. So when you put down the addresses on the last page, make sure, if you look at the last page, you see the address. Make sure you know the importance of this address, because these are the addresses that are used to serve official notices. So, you know, be careful about these addresses that you put. Now, disclosure, agency disclosure. Let's talk a little bit about agency disclosure. Agency disclosure, I'm sure you guys learned by now that every single transaction in California, it doesn't matter what kind of transaction you have, the sale of any real property requires agency disclosure. But for leases, it's different though. For leases, if it's greater than a year, you need the agency disclosure. So this one is greater than a year, so we need to have the agency disclosure. Now, if you look at the, we'll talk about estoppel certificate next time because that is a standard provision. Let's talk about agency disclosure. Now, do you need a separate form or is it sufficient? Paragraph 25. Actually, paragraph 25 looks to be pretty good to me. But I usually like to use a separate form for agency disclosure. Plus, it's just a piece of paper just to be safe. So I usually just go ahead and include the independent agency disclosure that is separate from the lease agreement. Although the lease agreement does provide for agency disclosure, just in case you forgot. But despite of that, I usually like to use a separate agency disclosure form when it comes to signing leases that are greater than a year, that are longer than a year. No right to hold over, that's pretty standard. If you hold over, you're paying 150% of the base rent. Okay, so there's like a 50% extra for holdover rent. You hold over. Holdover means that you exceed the expiration date. After the expiration date, you did not leave and you're still there. Okay. This standard, I will talk about that next time. Nine. Now, if you have a guarantor, number 37 talks about guarantor. Many commercial leases require guarantor. So number 37 says, the guarantors, if any, shall each execute a guarantee in the form most recently published by the AIR. So when you sign leases that have guarantor, don't forget the guarantor form needs to be signed by the guarantor. And then we talk about options. Now, if you're going to include options in your commercial lease, be aware of the options personal to original lessee. So if there is an assignment, the assignee does not have the option because only the original lessee has the option. So let's say, for example, you represent a tenant who wants to take over a lease, a commercial lease, AI lease from another tenant. And it's got a 5-year lease with a 5-year option. And then about 4 years into the lease, this particular tenant decides to sublease, no, actually to assign this lease to another tenant. Bear in mind that this new tenant will not have the 5-year option. Do not make the mistake of telling the new tenant that he has the 5-year option. No, he does not. The only way he's going to get the 5-year option is if the landlord consents to waive 39.2 because it says options is personal to original lessee. Okay? Just keep that in mind. And 39.4 talks about default on option. What that means is that, let's say you have a tenant that signs a 5-year lease with a one-time 5-year option, and somehow there were situations when there were instances when the tenant was late in the payment. The tenant would be at risk of losing the option because it says, lessee shall have no right to exercise an option if during the period commencing with the giving of any notice of default and continuing until said default is cured, during the period of time any rent is unpaid without regard to whether notice is given lessee. So if the tenant forgot to pay the rent on time, okay, the tenant could lose the option. If the default occurred 12 months immediately preceding the exercise of something to keep in mind. This is actually pretty standard on these by the way. So just make sure you do not forget to pay your rent, or else you might lose your option. Skip this. And of course, there's a rule on ADA. Now, I always recommend arbitration these days. There's X here. ADA, there's a checkbox that you need to check on ADA. Now, if the property has been inspected, you will check have undergone an inspection. If if it has not undergone, you will check it has not undergone. Now, if it has undergone, you have two options: either check this option or that option. So if it has undergone a CASP inspection, now CASP is just someone who's an expert in ADA who will come and inspect and give you a report. And if your property is in compliance with ADA, you would check this box. If it's not in compliance with ADA, you check this box. It's actually required by statute that you disclose it on your lease. So therefore, do not leave these boxes blank. You either check this box, or this box. So one of the three options. Okay. All right. The rest is self-explanatory. So I'll let you read it for yourself. But I'm sure we'll cover more of the standard AIR lease provision. I just don't have a lot of time to cover each and every single one. I'll try to cover some on future training, so that in each training you will learn a few provisions, such that by the time we finish all the AIR training, you would have learned all the unique provisions in the AIR. Okay, that pretty much concludes today's meeting.